Hi, this is Jennifer Toronto with She Shall Be Praised, where we support women as mothers, as career professionals, everything in between, um, and growing and just, becoming wiser and being better in the different aspects of life. So today I'm going to be talking about can we have peace in the midst of the storm? That's part two of three. I originally published this in April 15 of 2008. I have edited, I did the first part last week. I'm editing them and updating them to, be more polished and appropriate for today. But I found when I went to, edit this one, there were really very minor changes that I made, almost nothing in the wording, just a couple of things to make it a little bit clearer and more readable. Um, but for those of you who are not interested in reading or maybe want to hear a little more, that's what this podcast is about. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read part two, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about, why I wrote it, what I was going through, and what it's done in my life. So I originally wrote Peace in the Midst of a Storm in three parts. For readability, I have decided to keep that format. Part one discussed the word peace and what that really means. Part two explores the purpose and function of the storms in our life. That's today's talk and reading. And then part three examines the Bible for insight into how to find that peace. So let's go ahead and jump in. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include an account of Jesus getting into a boat with his disciples and falling asleep just before a storm rises up. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a couple of things here, and this is part of what makes this a little bit different than just reading the blog. Um, this story, if you're a Christian, you've probably heard it. It's very popular in Christian terms. It's very clear what's happening here in the sense that um, this is about, having peace and Jesus being in control. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that because the purpose really is um, about the storm itself and the effect on the disciples. The disciples eventually wake Jesus up and calms the storm. In part three of Peace in the Midst of a Storm, this passage will give us great insight into having peace during the storms of life. But before we get there, I'd like to look at why he allows the storm in the first place. If he could calm it with a few words, he could certainly have prevented it. But he chose to have his disciples face the storm. Why? We won't know for sure until we see him face to face. But we can take a guess by looking at how God used testing in other situations. Earlier that day, Jesus had been teaching the crowds. Again he began to teach by the sea, and a very large crowd gathered around him. So he got into a boat on the sea and sat down, while the whole crowd was on the shore facing the sea. He taught them many things in parables. That's Mark 4, 1 through 2. But at times he separated his disciples, and privately he would explain everything to them. That's Mark 4:34. The storm came after this day of teaching. So why might this testing have followed his teaching? Scripture suggests to us an answer. God tests his people for many reasons. In Deuteronomy 8:16, Moses told the Israelites, "He fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers had not known, in order to humble and test you, so that in the end he might cause you to prosper." So there's one. He might cause you to prosper. And Solomon says to himself in Ecclesiastes 3:18, "This happens concerning people, so that God may test them and they may see for themselves that they are like animals." Now this one, after the reading, I'm going to come back to this one quite a bit. Scripture lists other reasons for testing, but God's most common purpose seems to be to determine if we will obey what he has taught us. Exodus 16 verse 4 describes such a time of testing. The Lord told Moses, "This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions." We may not know exactly why God tests us, but one thing the Bible assures us of is that all things work together for the good of those who love God. those who are called according to his purpose. We cannot know God unless we learn about him, and we learn about him through his word, Romans 10:17. But that knowledge is useless and empty unless we live out what we learn. Can you think of someone who spent years in church but does not demonstrate true faith? Life would be wonderful if just hearing the word changed us and we never needed testing, but that is not the case. As human beings, we hold on to our habits and we often require practice to learn to respond in new ways. Sometimes we refuse. Paul warns against this in 2 Timothy 3:1-9. Please forgive the length of this, but I think this entire passage is important to quote. But know this is the passage. Difficult times will come in the last days, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, without love for what is good, traitors, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to the form of religion but denying its power. Avoid these people, for among them are those who worm their way into the households and capture idle women burdened down by sins, led along by a variety of passions, always learning and never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, so these also resist the truth, men who are corrupt in mind, worthless in regard to the faith. But they will not make further progress, for their lack of understanding will be clear to all, as theirs was also. So look at what Paul says about these people. Holding to a form of religion but denying its power, always learning and never able to come to a knowledge of truth. These resist the truth, and they will not make further progress. Paul's talking about churchgoers. Why will they not make further progress? They resist the truth. We know they hear it because Paul says they're always learning. They may even actively study, but they deny its power. I'd love to know what the full range of Paul meant with that phrase, but I suspect that in some it means they failed their tests. When it came to practice, I bet these men acted without faith. Contrast them with Abraham, the man who is held up as an example of faithfulness. Foolish man, are you willing to learn that faith without works is useless? Wasn't Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was active together with his works, and by works faith was perfected. So the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness, and he was called God's friend. That's James chapter 2, verses 20-23. The word translated here perfected means to carry through completely, to accomplish, finish, bring to an end. A faith that has not been tested is only theoretical. When God tests our faith, he makes us use it. We can theorize about what we'll do in any given situation, but what we actually do in that situation reflects where our confidence lies. The question God wants to know and to show us is, does our confidence lie in him? Thankfully, we don't have to pass the test on the first try. I'd like to close part 2 with a quote from Paul and one from James on the repetitive nature of trials and their purpose. Paul tells the Romans in chapter 5, verses 3-4, we also rejoice in our afflictions, because we know that affliction produces endurance, endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope. Endurance doesn't happen with one test. It happens over time. James encourages us with this thought. Consider it a great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. James 1, verses 3-5. Trials do serve a valuable purpose, one that ends with us being complete. Hallelujah! But there is great news. God doesn't want us to suffer through trials. He wants us to have peace. In part three, we'll look at how to have that peace. Faith is not blind. Faith requires us to look at all available options and choose the best one. I pray that we all learn how. So that ends the reading. And um, when I looked at this, when I read it again, um, I really wanted to kind of, relate it back to what I've been through and what that has done in my life. I wrote this after Katrina. At that time, I had 4 children, ages 7 and under. We were running a business from the house. I was doing all the back end of the business. Um, I was running a house of 7 people with my 4 sons, and my mother lived with us, and my husband. And then also, uh, you know, um, things had gotten difficult. So this was about 3 years or 2.5 years after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. Um, right after the hurricane, we were rebuilding, we were growing, and then what began to happen was many of the jobs left the area. There, people left the area. Some people didn't come back for years or have never come back. And so during that time in 2008, a lot of people were moving out of this area to get jobs because their jobs had left. And a lot of our customers had left as well for that reason. And so at this point, money was beginning to really get tight and things were really difficult. And when I was younger, um, when life would get difficult, I fought it so much. I felt that it was so unfair. It hurt, it was painful. I was trying to do the best that I could. Nothing I, was doing was causing the situation necessarily, or nothing I was doing at the time. It just had become that. And I was powerless in many ways to change it. Um, could I have made some different decisions? Absolutely. But those all came with consequences. And I was having to weigh, it was the whole rock in a hard place scenario, and being a mom, being a stay at home mom, being a homeschooling mom, um, those were beautiful things in my life, but they did come at a cost. And so life was difficult, and it really drove me to this. And I want to go back real quick. You know, um, the second kind of point as to why we have the trials was this verse, which is Ecclesiastes 3:18. This happens concerning people so that God may test them, and they may see for themselves they are like animals. I don't want to focus on the they are like animals uh, so much, although that could be its own conversation. But really, I want to focus on the so that they may see for themselves. And it's funny because the difficult times in life, when we have to deal with problems, very difficult problems, it really shows us what we're made of. There was a saying someone used to say regularly in my life, and that was, if you want to know what a person is made of, shake them up and see what comes out. And it's so true. Whenever you're pushed to your limits, you find out like all of the conscious choices are stripped away and what's deeply ingrained in us comes out. And sometimes we don't like what we find out. It's very ugly. And we can even see and know we're having a very negative response to a situation. And yet, in many ways, we're powerless to change that. And so, this one, so that they may see for themselves, the testing shows us what's really in us. And when I look back at the difficulties that I've had in my life over the course of time, it's in those difficult times that the truth about who I was and how I handled life and what my expectations and responses were came out. And if we don't know we have a problem, we cannot address it. Even when we know, we may struggle to address it, but the reality is we might have this natural response that is very destructive, but if we're not pushed to those limits, we don't have to deal with it. And the difficulties in life, in my young life throughout these times, forced me to confront those things. And you really find out where your trust is when you're down to about nothing. That thing that you cling to, that you turn to solve your problems, sometimes it's you think you need to solve it all, but that tells you where your confidence lies. The funny thing is, the word confidence itself, that fide in the middle, confidence, that fide means faith, con means with. So confidence is with faith. Confidence, if you have confidence in something, that's what your faith is in. And a lot of times it's in us. And the really scary thing about that is we fail, and we fail over and over. And it's funny because usually what really prompts change in our life is a failure, is coming to the point of seeing, I cannot do this. I can't do it this way. All my efforts are resulting, it's not getting me what I want. And so that's when you have to change, because what do they say? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And so sometimes if the results become so painful, that makes us willing to change and do something different because we have nothing left. So that's the overarch, when I look back at the difficulties in my life, they reveal to me who I really was and what I was really trusting in. And without the difficult times in my life, I would not have seen that so clearly. It would have taken me much longer to see some of the ugly things about myself than when they were brought to the forefront because life just got so hard that it erupted. And here's the other thing. This idea of endurance, like confidence has in that word is with faith, confidence. Endurance is about enduring. And we don't have to, if we don't have to endure something, meaning if it's easy for us, if it's pleasant, then it doesn't really build endurance. Because endurance in that is the assumption that it's difficult. There's something difficult that you are pushing through regardless. And one difficult time in my life would not have necessarily created endurance in me. I'll give you an example. At age 40, I decided I was going to be a runner. Now, prior to this, I had never been a runner, ever. Um, Whenever I tried jogging, my knees would hurt. I just figured, some people could do it, not me. But at 40, there were some things happening in my life, and I needed a change. And I said, you know what? There was a Couch to 5K app that was really popular. And I said, I think I'm going to try that. So at age 40, I decided I was going to try and become a runner. And what I found, to give you the result, what I found was the pain that I had in my knees went away as my muscles grew stronger. And that as I progressed through the Couch to 5K, I hated running. I hated it. It didn't feel good to me. I feel good after, but it still doesn't really feel good to me. Some days, whatever. But, you know, I hated it. But I found that if I made myself push through it, I could go further and further and further as time went on. And so I did eventually get up to running a 5K. I've fallen back. I didn't never run one. I never entered one, but I could have done it. And I'm I dropped off and now I'm picking it back up. But the point was that as I did this thing that was uncomfortable and I didn't want to do it and it was difficult, as I did it, I could handle more and more and more until ultimately I could jog the whole way because endurance was being built in me. And it's the same thing when we go through the trials in life. What we learn going through a trial is we can go through it. We can go through it, we can come out on the other side, and we're going to be okay. And that's endurance. That is what's being built up. And so, me today at 50, I know that I can handle more than I think I can. And I know it because I have. More than once, I've been at the end. I didn't think I could take another step further. I didn't think I could keep going. And I did. I, I just survived it. And every time I did, I learned that I was capable of doing more than I thought I would be able to do. And so that's what with this the trials have taught me is that how I feel is often deceptive because there's something in me that wants to fight against life being difficult. I know that everyone experiences trouble, but I want to fight against that. But I have learned that even when I get pushed to the edge, I'm still capable of doing more. And so I'm less afraid of the difficult things in life than I used to be because I know that no matter how uncomfortable it gets, I will make it through. I will be okay. And if we look at that verse, if we go back to that, um, it says, "We rejoice in our afflictions because we know that affliction produces endurance." And that's true. In fact, I recently went through a very difficult time. It was a trial. And my whole life, there has been an issue that I've been running from. And this issue has been since I was an infant. Before I was born, actually, I was born into a scenario. And that's haunted me my entire life. And the way I dealt with it really was to run from it. That whenever this thing rose its head in my life, I just cut out anyone who was in any way involved in it and um and isolated myself from it. And when I was going through this trial, I couldn't do that. It was not an option to me. And it forced me, to realize that that's what I had been doing. On some level, I knew that. But it forced me to stop and really look at it and say that as long as my response to this is to run and to hide, I'm never going to be the woman I want to be. I'm not going to be able to progress and move forward and truly make peace with this issue in my life and be able to love people fully and to be as strong as I want to be. You can't run from problems and be strong in them. You cannot. And so it really forced me, even though it was painful and unfair and unjust and difficult. It was a beautiful thing that had happened in my life because otherwise I'd have kept running and I'd have had this huge glaring weakness in my character and in my life. And I would not have been able to see it for what it was. So we rejoice in our afflictions because we know that affliction produces endurance. Endurance produces proven character. Well, you can't have proven character unless you have done something over and over. And proven character produces hope. And the hope is that I know I can get through it because I have gotten through it. Things that were so painful that I thought would break me didn't break me. They might have broke the bad pieces off. They didn't break me. And so therefore, I have hope because I know that whatever life throws my way, ultimately, I'm going to be okay. But not just that. I'm not just going to be okay. I'm going to be better. And so your testing of your faith produces endurance, and the complete work of endurance, and this is James chapter 1 verses 3 to 5 through 5, but endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. And so that's what the trials do in our lives. They make us mature and complete so that we lack nothing. And so in a sense, that's why we should rejoice in the difficulties, because they're going to do a work in us that cannot be done otherwise. We have to practice what we believe. We have to put it into action. We can't just read about it and think about it and believe it and lie down and never act on it. We are not complete until the things we learn are made reality in our lives. So if you're going through a trial, I'm not saying it's not difficult. And I don't want to minimize it at all. And I know that sometimes it breaks us. But the breaking, when we put our pieces back together, we leave out the things that don't work so well. And we get put together better than we were before we went through that thing. And that's the hope. That's the hope. And we have a God who loves us and wants what's best for us. And we don't have to put ourselves together. He will help us become a better person than we were before. And it's through these trials and testings and difficulties that that process happens, that he helps us to become more pure and more mature and more complete. So I hope that you found this encouraging and helpful. A lot of why I do this is not really to be about me. I talk about what I know about, um, but I'd love to hear from you. So if there's something you'd like to talk about, or if you want to make some comments, please do. You can find me at sheshallbepraised.com and on different social media sites, but you can go there and you'll see where, the different places that I'm on. I recently did a Linktree account, so I'll make sure and put that on my website as well so that you can find me on the different platforms. But, I hope you have a great day. It's beautiful outside. Many of you are enjoying the outdoors. Um, and so I hope you just have a wonderful week. And I look forward ultimately to having conversations back and forth on these things. So have a wonderful day. And till next time.